Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh, yes. Flora Payne Whitney, Quentin's secret fiancée, was a frequent visitor. So much so that his parents soon figured out the young couple's arrangement. With her husband still in France, Ethel shuttered her house in Oyster Bay, and she and their two children moved in with her parents. They and a nursemaid lived in the old nursery rooms on the south side of the house from the summer of 1917 into the summer of 1918. The beginning of 1918 brought a major change to the house. It was finally wired for electricity at a cost of $1,552.34. The electric light has been a convenience, and as yet we are not burned to the ground, Edith wrote to Kermit 6 months later. Nothing, however, was done about the heating system, which never seemed to adequately live up to its name. Sagamore Hill is just as warm as it ever was in cold weather, Edith wrote to Bammy. We have plenty of coal, but a bird cage is hard to heat. The war created a manpower shortage for those looking to hire or retain servants. Edith complained to Kermit that the servant question has risen to mountain-high difficulties. I can get no waitress in all of New York who is willing to spend a winter at Oyster Bay. But the Roosevelts fared better than most other affluent families. Mary Sweeney, the longest-serving of the Sagamore Hill servants, remained Edith Roosevelt's housekeeper and personal maid for the rest of her employer's life. Theodore's health continued to decline. Already blind in his left eye from an injury received in 1904 while boxing at the White House, in February 1918 he was admitted to Roosevelt Hospital in New York for surgery on abscesses in his thigh and ears. Inflammation developed in the left inner ear, prompting fears that the colonel might not survive. But the fever broke and TR went home in early March. The Roosevelts continued to fret over the well-being of their 4 sons, all at or near the front in France or the Middle East. First, Quentin developed a severe case of pneumonia. Then Archie was hit by a shrapnel, which injured his left leg and broken arm. Ted was promoted to lieutenant colonel and decorated for conspicuous gallantry after being gassed, and later he was wounded in the leg. Kermit, who had received the British Military Cross for gallantry, obtained a discharge so he could join the American forces and was made a captain in the artillery regiment. For the first time in his crowded life, TR had trouble sleeping. I wake up in the middle of the night wondering if the boys are all right. And thinking how I could tell their mother if anything happened, he told a friend. Roosevelt made a Western speaking trip in June 1918 and returned to Sagamore Hill with a high fever and erysipelas, a skin infection in his left foot. In July 1918, Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt shot down his first German airplane. A delighted TR wrote to Ted that the last of the lion's brood has been blooded. 10 days later, the colonel was in the library when Associated Press reporter Philip Thompson, a friend of the family, came to the house with a censored cablegram sent to the New York Sun that read, "Watch Sagamore Hill for..." Asked what it meant, Roosevelt replied, "Something has happened to one of the boys. It can't be Ted or Archie, for both are recovering from wounds. It's not Quentin, since he's not at the moment in the danger zone, so it must be Quentin. His mother must not be told until there is no hope left." Theodore and Edith dressed for dinner as usual, and then talked and read as if everything was normal. Oh, God. But Edith must have suspected something was wrong, because there is a rare blank page in her diary for that day. Thompson returned the next morning and told Roosevelt on the piazza that he had verification that Quentin's plane had been attacked by 2 German fighters and shot down behind enemy lines. Oh, God. But Mrs. Roosevelt, TR gasped, "How am I going to break it to her?" He went back inside the house and half an hour later handed Thompson a brief statement. "Quentin's mother and I are very glad that he got to the front and had a chance to render some service to his country and show the stuff that was in him before his fate befell him. Edith emerged a few hours later and, thinking more about her husband than herself, said to Thompson, "We must do everything we can to help him. The burden must not rest entirely on his shoulders." Oh, God. Quentin Roosevelt was shot down on July 14th, 1918. Only 2 days later, Roosevelt fulfilled his promise to keep the keynote address at the New York State Republican Convention in Saratoga. To mitigate their grief, TR took Edith for 2 weeks to Maine, where Ethel and her children were spending the summer. When they returned to Cove Neck, Alice was waiting to help them get through reading Quentin's last letters from friends. The mood was brightened by word that Archie was on his way home. He arrived early in September and got to see his 5-month-old baby, Archibald Bullock Roosevelt Jr., for the first time as a beaming TR looked on from the piazza. To help cope with Quentin's death, once a week his parents invited 20 enlisted men from nearby Camp Mills in Mineola to come to Sagamore Hill. Edith described the regiment to Kermit. "Father makes a little talk to them in the north room about his flags and trophies. Then I take them to the dining room and give them some tea and cake and cigarettes, and sometimes we walk to the garden." The irony is, Quentin, the youngest, was the first to die, and Alice, the oldest, was the last to die. At 96 years old, she was the longest living child of a president. TR entered his 6th decade while enduring crippling attacks of rheumatism, compounded by the continuing grief over the loss of his youngest child. Quentin's death shook him greatly, Edith told Kermit in an October 29th, 1918 letter. "I can see how constantly he thinks of him. Sad thoughts of what Quentin would have counted for in the future." By early November, one of TR's feet was so swollen he could not wear a shoe. 3 physicians came to Sagamore Hill and ordered him to rest in bed. He overrode them to vote on November 5th and felt even worse. 6 days later, he returned to Roosevelt Hospital for treatment of inflammatory rheumatism contracted in Brazil and the abscesses. Edith remained at his hospital bedside for 44 days. Roosevelt was able to return home on Christmas Day, although he was still weak and suffering from vertigo and from inflammation in the inner ear. Alice, Ethel, and Archie were waiting for their parents with Christmas dinner. In the following days, TR ate breakfast in bed, came downstairs for lunch, and then lay on the sofa in the library, reading and dictating letters. On December 29th and December 30th, Edith took her husband for an hour's drive, and he seemed to improve. But rainy weather on New Year's Day in 1919 again gave him severe pain in his leg and hand. He began to spend most of his time upstairs lying on the sofa in the gate room, the old nursery that faced south and the warmest space in the house. On the first Sunday in January, the 5th, Roosevelt remained in bed reading aloud to his wife or listening while she read, writing to Kermit, or just relaxing with Edith. Flora visited. TR worked for 11 hours on a magazine article and newspaper editorial. Friends came to the house, but the Colonel was too weak to seek them. Edith wrote to Ted several days later. "Father was in your old nursery and loved the view," of which he spoke, and as it got dusk he watched the dancing waves and spoke of the happiness of being home and made little plans for me. He was very sweet all day. Since Quentin was killed he has been sad. Only Ethel's little girl had the power to make him merry. Edith had finished playing solitaire at the table beside TR's bed and was about to leave when he reportedly looked at her and inquired, "I wonder if you will ever know how I love Sagamore Hill." Around 10 p.m., TR asked his wife to help him sit up because he felt as if his heart or lungs were about to stop working. Edith called for the nurse, who had said his pulse was good, but she still sent for a local doctor, who reported the same results. The nurse gave him morphine so he could sleep through the night. At about midnight, James Amos arrived to help watch Roosevelt during the night and helped put him to bed in the gate room. Amos turned off the light and napped in front of the fire. Edith went in to look at her husband twice around 12:30 a.m. and 2 a.m. At 4 a.m., the nurse woke Edith in her room because TR had stopped breathing. Rushing to her husband of 33 years, she leaned over him and called, "Theodore, darling!" Edith wrote in her diary that he had a sweet sound sleep. She wrote Kermit to Kermit that he seemed just asleep, only he could not hear. Theodore Roosevelt had died from an embolism on January 6, 1919, at the age of 60. At 6 a.m., Edith telephoned Corinne and told her what happened. Theodore's younger sister came to Sagamore late that afternoon, and the two old friends walked along the shore and in the woods. When they returned to the house at twilight, it was being circled by low-flying airplanes that Edith surmised must have been dispatched from the camp where Quentin had trained as a Varner. Archie cabled his brothers with a terse message. The old lion is dead. Roosevelt's coffin, draped with Rough Rider flags, lay in the north room before his funeral on January 8th. Quentin's favorite prayer was read, and the cortege led it to Christchurch, where 500 mourners waited. Following the custom of the era for windows, Edith remained behind with her daughters and other Roosevelt women to read through their prayers that would be offered at the church. After the service, the procession began to head east back towards Cove Neck, but stopped at Young's Memorial Cemetery in Oyster Bay Cove. There the 26th president was buried 26 steps up the hillside, a short distance from his beloved Sagamore Hill. To be continued.